Hello, psychology students. Our last chapter for the semester, we're going to get through the Cognition and Intelligence review for your test coming up on either Thursday or Friday. So it'll be a pretty typical test, just a regular chapter test, because this is a longer chapter. Sorry, there's the bell. Because this is a longer chapter, there will be 30 multiple choice and 1 FRQ. So let's start with just the definition of cognition. Mental activities associated with language, problem solving, and remembering. So, I always want you to think of the word think when you hear cognition, but cognition really involves all of those factors. And I actually kind of crossed that off because I was going to ask you a specific question, but I actually threw that one out. So let's go on to divergent and convergent thinking. Convergent thinking is when we narrow our possibilities to determine the single best solution. So it's a thinking strategy that allows us to narrow down all those possibilities and use or employ the single best solution. Divergent thinking is when you come up with many solutions after looking at the whole situation. In all reality, we probably, if we use good thinking skills and problem solving skills, we probably use both divergent and then convergent skills, but as long as you know the difference between the two. Confirmation bias is our tendency to look for evidence that supports a belief. However, oftentimes we might ignore that relevant info because we're looking to confirm what we believe is true. And so maybe when you think about what your assessment of validity, when you gave those surveys of attractiveness, did you, and you maybe didn't even realize it, did you give it to participants because you probably didn't randomly select them? Did you give it to participants who probably think like you and would maybe confirm your beliefs of attractiveness, your definition of attractiveness? That's kind of how confirmation bias works. Functional fixedness. This is the inability to solve a problem because of a fixation or use of an object. If we can overcome functional fixedness, that means we can look at an object for other things besides what it is. But if we, I find that I do this a lot in my kitchen. If I look at a fork, I think of it as a fork, but I could use a fork for a lot of different things. If I use it as a fork, I have functional fixedness. If I use it to squeeze the lemon juice out of a lemon, then I've overcome functional fixedness. Framing is the way an issue is posed, and it determines our feelings. Remember, this was the idea of the check. Remember when I talked about, what if I offered you $1,000 bonus, but then I offered somebody else $1,500 bonus? Well, with the $1,000 bonus, you're really happy until you find out that somebody else maybe had it different. And so then your feelings change about the issue. And sometimes even the ways people say things can determine your feelings about the issue. How, sometimes I always say, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. Insight is a sudden understanding of a problem or a solution. It's that aha moment. It just kind of comes to you and you get it. Mental set. This was one of them. I was actually very impressed on your quiz. I think a lot of you get mental set. It's an approach to problem solving that happens in the same manner that has worked before because of a fixation on success. It's kind of like that old adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. You continue to behave and respond to problems in the same way that you have before because it has worked. I hate to say that this is often what we do with writing papers or studying for tests or whatever it happens to be, but if you're a procrastinator like me and you are relatively successful at being a procrastinator, you keep going with it. And that's a mental set. Heuristics are shortcut thinking strategies. They're a rule of thumb. The thing about heuristics is it's not only a shortcut thinking strategy, but it's also kind of a behavior and thinking strategy. So or behavior, I should say, and well, we'll just say a behavior strategy. It's good, it works, and sometimes we don't even consciously think about it. It's like a judgment. It's kind of like a stereotype. It's doesn't necessarily mean it's accurate, but more often than not, it takes little effort and saves time, so you continue to go with it, kind of like a mental set. So representative heuristics is judging a situation based on similar prototypes. Remember when we talked about prototypes in the last chapter? So we compare our mental representation to something else that we've known. Perfect example, I was out yesterday and I saw somebody driving a car that I felt like, man, they don't seem like that type to drive that kind of car. I even had a representative heuristics in my head. I put the truck driver there on the margin. Did that gal, that young woman, look like a truck driver? Is that what your mental representation is in your head of a truck driver? For me, my mental representation of whoever drove that it was a Dodge Charger, and it was an old woman. And I pulled up next to her at the light, and I was like, oh, I don't know. I just, for some reason, I don't think of older, elderly women driving a Dodge Charger. It just is not in my mental set, not part of my heuristics. Availability heuristics is a judgment based on vivid or memorable events that come to mind very quickly. And so, this was the one with the shark attack. We can't imagine dying of like skin cancer, but we could imagine dying of a shark attack. However, skin cancer is much more likely of a killer when you're just sitting there out in the sun and not protecting yourself from the sun's rays. But things like that don't make the newspaper. Availability heuristics are usually those stereotypes or judgments that we make because they're the type of stories that would have made headlines. An algorithm is a step-by-step process of problem solving. This is for sure going to be accurate. Like this, it ensures a correct answer, but it is very time consuming, often very tedious, and so we don't even try it usually. Usually we go straight to heuristics. Now we're guaranteed to get an answer, but that could be ages before we come up with it. If you've ever thought about a password, every single password could be cracked, except think about the time it would take to do it. You could come up with an algorithm for it, but it would take a long time. And some people are willing to put in that time if they want to crack a password. Language. This is a huge, huge part of cognition. I cannot stress the importance of language enough. It is the crown jewel of cognition. It is arguably the most important part of cognition. And we know that language happens in stages, and truly it is what separates humans from animals. So as we begin to learn language, and it starts out, little by little, bit by bit. And there's people like Chomsky. Noam Chomsky said that basically all humans learn language simply because of our nature. The nature of being human allows us to have language. He did say, though, that we have to learn it by a critical period. And you see, I made a little arrow down to Jeannie. I'll get to her in a second. So Chomsky says the nature of human beings will allow us to learn language. And typically we learn it through first phonemes and then morphemes. So phonemes are the sounds of words, literally like b, k, d, f, g, all those sounds. And then we learn it through the meaning of words. And if you think back when you were in elementary school, did you have like sight words all over? They're really short words. And as you continued on through your elementary years, you would have started increasing your vocabulary, your morphemes, and the meanings of words would continue to grow and increase. This is also what I mean by language in stages. So, that really intriguing documentary, and I was impressed on how everybody talked on the Padlet about what they found surprising, or, what they thought was kind of odd or interesting. Jeannie never really fluently learned language, even though Chomsky says it's in our nature to have language, and we did see that. She was able to learn language and actually learn it very quickly after she was, found. But because of her deprivation and her environment of all those years, she had probably passed the critical period and could never fluently learn a language. And we know that Jeannie is alive today, and we think that she does not have language skills. We don't exactly know, but we feel like she has probably maybe about a 1 to 2 year old language skills. Now her other IQ skills we really have no idea on, but it is an intriguing story and a good one to realize how important language is to intelligence. Which brings us right then to the definition of intelligence: the ability to learn from experience and use it in a productive way. There we go. To use it in a productive way. So you can learn from your experience, but if you don't use it in the future in a productive way, you can't really say you have that intelligence. So fluid intelligence is this ability for abstract problem solving and efficiency to pick up new skills. We know that fluid intelligence decreases with age. I felt like I had a small victory. I gotta give a shout out to Noah Raber. He basically, like, between the two of us, we figured out how to get the 3 identical strangers, and we figured it out. And Noah kind of like told me what I could do, and I was trying, and I finally figured it out, and I was like, I did it. I felt so impressed because for me that was a really hard skill to learn. So I have a little fluid intelligence, maybe not a lot. It's decreasing with age. Crystallized intelligence is using knowledge that's gained over time. This is what we refer to as wisdom. This is all of that experience, and then you use it. Remember, when we use it in a productive way, that's crystallized intelligence, and that increases with age. As we get more experience, as we know more, as we learn more, as we use those skills more, we increase our crystallized intelligence. The theories of intelligence, well, there's many of them, and there's a big difference in opinion of what intelligence is. The 3 that I want you to know, that, well, let's be honest, the College Board wants you to know, are Spearman's G factor. Now, a lot of people will argue that there's not one general factor, that human beings are so diverse, we're so different, that we don't have one general intelligence, underlying intelligence. However, Spearman makes the argument, and we can see it when we even do something as basic as an intelligence test, an IQ test. We're basing it off of a underlying general factor. We might test different types or different parts of intelligence, speed or processing skills or whatever it happens to be, but Spearman is saying there's one underlying intelligence. Sternberg is the one that maybe, and I've been noticing in the last few days, people were kind of rethinking like this, replying in ways like this, of there are 3 factors of intelligence: creative, analytical, and practical. Sometimes it's called the triarchic theory. And the creative is the creative, right? Like, we get that one. The analytical, that's what we think of like the typical school book smart. And the practical is the typical street smarts. Gardner, he has the 8 intelligence, and I just said, like, basically know all 8 of them and know how to apply them. So the bodily kinesthetic, the musical, the interpersonal, the intrapersonal, know all 8 of those, please, and make sure you actually have a basic understanding of them. That chart that I had on PowerPoint is a good one for that. When we're looking at intelligence, we typically scale it on a bell curve, a normal distribution. We know that the baseline, the average intelligence score is 100, and most people, 68% of people, score within 1 standard deviation of the mean. That's Sternberg really. Spearman, giving us a general intelligence level. However, we have to have a standardization of scores. We have to have some meaningful score. Like, we can't have all these different variables and expect that our normal distribution will be normal. Like, it's going to be skewed. It's going to be a positive skew or a negative skew if we don't have good standardization. Some meaningful scores based on uniform procedures of a representative group. Like, it has to be a good representative sample. We need to ensure for reliability and validity, and those 2 words are coming up here shortly. When we talk about IQ tests or intelligence tests, first we have to look to Binet. Alfred Binet designed the first IQ test for school-age children, and even yet today, that's the one that we use mostly for children. Now today it's known as the Stanford Binet because it's kind of been adopted for American school-age children. But what Binet was doing was looking at the mental versus the chronological age. He didn't really concern himself with chronological age. If you're 6 years old, that doesn't really matter to Binet. What Binet cares about is where you are in comparison. And so if you're learning at a 7-year-old level, but you're 6, well, then let's start teaching you at a 7-year-old level, because teaching you at a 6-year-old level isn't doing you any good. The same could be true if you're 6, but you're learning at a 5-year-old level. Well, let's teach you at the 5-year-old level, because you being 6 doesn't mean that you're learning at that level. So he was much more concerned with the mental age. And the formula is mental age over chronological age times 100. You should know that formula. I'm going to ask you a few basic questions. So no, mental divided by chronological times 100 will give us the IQ, the age. The WAIS score, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, this was developed for adults. Later there was one for children. The Stanford Binet is still probably the most widely used, but the Wechsler Adult Test is definitely the most widely used for adults. It's a good one. It has different measures of intelligence, meaning there's different categories, if you will, to measure different things. There's something called achievement and aptitude tests. Achievement tests test what a person has already learned. Those are like the AP tests, the ACT. Aptitude tests predict the future of how well you will do, or your ability of how well you will do later on. We talked a lot about like an LSAT or an MCAT. Reliability. I'm looking over your assessments of validity, and I want to, because we know that if you don't have a reliable test, you can't have a valid test. And so we know that a reliable test yields consistent results time after time. If there's perfect correlation on like a split half test or a test retest or a parallel test, we can be pretty sure that we have a good, reliable test. perfect correlation means they scored exactly the same. That would be a +1. If there's no correlation, means you gave them a test, and then you gave half the test to them one day, and you gave the other half to test to them the other day, and they did really well this day but really bad the next day, like really, really differently bad, then we're going to say there's almost no correlation between, say, that split half test or whatever, parallel test or test retest, however it happens to work out. So we're looking for a reliable test that's also valid. The test measures what it intends to measure. In the content, is the content testing what it intends to measure? And then finally, heritability, the degree to which genetics affects traits. For those of you who are at home, I hope you start watching the documentary on Three Identical Strangers. You're going to hear this word of heritability. You're going to be able to think about the environmental influences. You're going to even see the differences in ability and achievement and things like that. The nature, this is constantly the nature-nurture debate. It affects intelligence, and we see this mostly in studies of identical twins. They show high heritability. If their identical twins are raised apart, they show a lower heritability, still a strong heritability. This is measured on a scale of 0 to 1. So the closer it is to 1, the more it's a nature effect, meaning it's a genetic trait. And if it's closer to a 0, there's more strong pull toward a nurture or environmental effect. And there are a lot of environmental influences, such as, unfortunately, in IQ, we see a socioeconomic status for many, many different reasons. Poverty levels, a mother's IQ level. If, for instance, let's just talk about poverty. If you are living in a house with 6 or 7 people in a very small 2-bedroom apartment or 1-bedroom apartment, you have very little ability for quiet time, to think, to reflect, to read, to sleep well. And so we can see that those types of environmental influences really have an effect on our IQ. And finally, stereotype threat. This is a contributing factor to racial and gender gaps in academic performance and cultural factors, for that matter. When people say or tell you, or you start believing that maybe because of your race or because of your gender or whatever it happens to be, you're not as good, you start believing that and almost performing to that level. It's kind of like this preconceived notion, and that's known as stereotype threat. And we see it coming out oftentimes even in bias against tests. All right, that's it. Please give me a holler if you have any questions, but otherwise I'll see you for the tests on Thursday and Friday. Take care. Bye-bye.